Mr. President, as a former chair of the Energy and Natural Resources Committee, I have a pretty good sense of how complicated it is to pull together a legislative package of public lands like the one that this Senate is about to pass. So I'd like to begin my comments with a special shout out to our chair and committee leadership, Chair Murkowski, Senator Cantwell, Senator Manchin, then Chairman and my friend, Congressman Rob Bishop, and now Chairman Grijalva, for helping me negotiate the Oregon provisions in this bill. Mr. President, this morning I have brought to the floor of this Senate a copy of a wonderful story. It's called Fire at Eden's Gate, and it's an inspiring account of our late Republican governor, Tom McCall. Nobody understood better than Tom McCall a very basic idea. Protecting our public treasures should not be a partisan proposition. In this day and age, too often it can feel like this sense of common purpose around protecting our public treasures is slipping away. But I hope that this bill is a bit of a signal that it's coming back. And that's why this morning, Mr. President, I'm dedicating the Oregon provisions of this bill to the memory of our late, great Tom McCall. If Governor McCall were here with us this morning, he would say that the Oregon provisions in this legislation are all about protecting and enhancing Oregon's unique and extraordinary livability. At the heart of that livability are our natural treasures and the recreation economy that pumps billions of dollars into Oregon, especially in our rural communities. Mr. President, I'm heading home this weekend. I have town hall meetings in every one of Oregon's 36 counties, and in those rural areas, I'm constantly seeing people whose livelihood revolves around that theory Tom McCall talked about, our unique livability. We would see small businesses. We'll see guides who are taking folks out into the backcountry. Well, people who sell gear. And it's a big economic multiplier, the recreation economy. And it's all tied to what Tom McCall talked about, which is protecting Oregon's livability. Tom McCall would be very pleased about a number of aspects of this bill, and I want to tick them off briefly this morning. I believe Governor McCall would be especially pleased that this legislation does more to protect Oregonians from the growing threats of wildfires that in our part of the world are not your grandfather's fires. They're becoming infernos. We're seeing fires leap our majestic Columbia River, something that used to be unheard of, but is a reality today. So this legislation, in my view, makes a real difference in reducing the threats of wildfires, and I want to talk about one provision specifically, and that's what the bill does for Crooked River Ranch in Central Oregon. The Crooked River Ranch provision that I worked with the committee leadership on, and we got in this bill, is just common sense because it reduces the risk of fire and also prevents the increasing backlog that prevents our land managers from clearing out dead and dying hazardous fuels near the homes of families. And folks from this really small community, the Crooked River Ranch, came to my town hall meetings and told me about their very understandable fear of being engulfed in one of these infernos, which is how I describe some of these fires just leap through federal, state, local, private kind of boundaries. And I want everybody at Crooked River Ranch this morning to know that the provisions of this bill that reduce the risk of those huge fires and promote forest health and reduce the backlog that is so critical to preventing fires in the future, the provisions in this bill show all those folks from Crooked River Ranch who came to our town hall meetings. I think the provisions of this bill shows that the United States Senate has listened to them and responded to this very real threat. In addition, I can this morning picture, Mr. President, Tom McCall, this towering figure, striding through the forests that this bill designates as the first new wilderness in Oregon in nearly a decade. And here I'm talking about the Devil's Staircase Wilderness Area, 30,000 acres of rugged rainforests in our beautiful Oregon Coast Range. This is an untouched, pristine area, and it was named after a series of cascading waterfalls. It's an area that is so remote and so steep that hikers, many of whom come from all over the country and literally from around the globe, when they come to Devil's Staircase, they can only gain access after a days-long trek through miles of Devil's Club, which is a tall, spiky bush that has irritated many a hiker. Well, few people have actually seen the waterfalls and the primeval stands of old-growth trees that surround it. In true Tom McCall fashion, this bill ensures that these majestic Douglas firs and tall trees on the hike are there for future generations to come. And that in particular is something that Tom McCall talked to me about personally. And I'm going to mention volunteers in the forests and a conversation I had with Tom McCall not long before he passed. But he was always coming back to trying to make sure that those of us in positions to make policy were thinking about future generations. Future generations. Nancy and I are older parents. Twins that are 11, little redhead who's 6. Pictures available on my iPhone after my presentation. And so, whenever I look at them, I think about what Tom McCall said. You're making policy for future generations. And now, because of the provisions here to protect Devil's Staircase and create this unique new wilderness area. It's going to be there for those future generations of Oregonians, Americans, and literally visitors from around the world. Now, while we're on the topic of remote areas in my state, the lands bill we're about to vote on protects yet another very special place, the Chetco River in southwestern Oregon. The Chetco lies within steep mountainous terrain in the heart of the Kamiapsis Wilderness area. This river, one of the wildest in Oregon, drops almost 4,000 feet in elevation from its headwaters in the Rogue Siskiyou National Forest before it empties into the Pacific Ocean near Brookings. Now, this area would be particularly beloved by Tom McCall because it is a haven for treasured Oregon fish species like salmon and steelhead. And there are so many pictures, Mr. President, of Tom McCall in effect throwing a rod because he loved to fish, And although it is a hike to get there, it's an irresistible challenge to even the most proficient anglers and whitewater kayakers, but they will find it the trip of a lifetime. In addition to its recreation benefits and wildlife-sustaining habitat, the river also provides a clean and pristine source of drinking water for the city of Brookings and the town of Harbor on the Oregon coast. But for years, this extraordinarily pure river with crystal clear water was being threatened by those who simply didn't appreciate what it meant for fishing and protecting the future and simply just looked at as an opportunity for mining. This legislation ends the future potential for mineral exploitation along the banks of the Chetco once and for all. I and other members of the delegation have been working for years to try to make sure that this was done permanently. We would have to lurch from one kind of administrative fix to another. Now we are embedding in black letter law that we are ending the future potential for mineral exploitation along the banks of the Chetco River. I have been working on this for my entire time in public service representing Oregon in the United States Senate, and it's something that I, again, apropos of that shout out to Senator Murkowski, Senator Cantwell, Chair Bishop, Chair Grijalva, I'm so appreciative of. Now, the Chetco, by the way, is just one of the many, many rivers the Public Lands Bill will protect and conserve in my home state. The bill protects more than 250 miles of rivers and streams in Oregon by adding them to the federal Wild and Scenic Rivers system. Now, as an Oregonian, I know it doesn't take an act of Congress to remind us that rivers and streams are the backbone of Oregon's recreation economy. And I spoke about it earlier, Mr. President, but this is something that, in my view, is missed in much of the debate about public lands. Recreation is an enormous economic multiplier for our communities. I see our new colleague in the chair as the presiding officer, and I know Florida cares deeply about treasures. So again, this is not a partisan concern. This is all about looking down the road and when I have a chance, as I will this weekend, to be home for town hall meetings, I'm always stunned at how far the reach is with respect to the recreation economy. I was home recently, and a young man said that he wanted to talk to me about his kayak business. And so we visited, and he talked about how he had tourists come and he would take them out in his kayak. And then he would talk to me about how there's a global market for his kayaks. I'm the senior Democrat on the Senate Finance Committee with jurisdiction over trade. He asked me about my view on economics. 1 out of 5 jobs in Oregon revolves around international trade. We like to make things and grow things and add value to them and ship them all over the world. Well, the recreation economy creates opportunities here at home, as that young man took folks out in his kayak, but creates even more opportunities as the rest of the world benefits from his kayaks as well. So in Oregon, we outdoor enthusiasts understand that from every corner of the United States, we've got an opportunity to show Oregon's true natural beauty, and as well as giving people the experience of a lifetime in seeing unparalleled treasures. It's a big boost to a lot of families and increasing their incomes. Rivers and streams such as those we're going to protect with the new additions to the federal wild and scenic river system are a place for families to picnic, for anglers to cast a fly rod into some of the best fishing holes in the country, and for whitewater rafters to get an adrenaline rush while enjoying Oregon's treasures. I can tell you about Tom McCall because Tom McCall loved fishing almost more than life itself. And I'm telling you, he'd look at these provisions and he'd say that what this bill does to protect those hundreds of miles of wild and scenic rivers is something that he would call part of laying the future for future generations, but making sure that there's a lot that benefits the people of my state and our country right now. From Brookings to the Willamette Valley, from the Chetco to the Molalla River, this bill and the provisions we were able to negotiate on rivers protects treasured fishing streams and salmon habitat in every single corner of Oregon. And as I indicated, it's going to be a real shot in the arm to rural communities that are going to be able to create world-class recreation destinations and look at that recreation economy as an increasing opportunity to build a more secure economic future. Especially important are some of the protections this bill gives to the Rogue River in southern Oregon. 51 years after President Johnson named the Rogue to the original Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, this bill adds just over 120 miles of important Rogue River tributaries to the list. In doing so, this bill further protects and safeguards the mighty Rogue that the iconic Western author Zane Grey put on the map when he wrote about the wilderness and remoteness of the river from his cabin at Winkle Bar nearly 1 century ago. With these designations, Oregon will now have more miles of wild and scenic river than any other state in the contiguous 48. Stay tuned, folks. Alaska is the only state that has more miles designated, but given that state is about 6 times the size of my Oregon, I still think we're in a position to catch up. As the governor who gave the public access to all of Oregon's beaches and passed the nation's first bottle recycling bill, Tom McCall valued those who volunteered to keep Oregon so special. He was a great champion of promoting volunteers. Again, something that historically has been bipartisan. And I ran the legal aid program for older people for a number of years, the Great Panthers for about 7 years. And shortly before he passed, Tom McCall came to see me, and I'd never been elected anything. I was stunned that such an important person would come to see an obscure fellow like myself. And he was talking about the elderly, and it really led to a broader discussion of volunteerism and people participating and getting involved in their communities. And because he was always working to get people involved in cleaning up our beaches, and then he passed the nation's first bottle recycling bill, he always came back, as he did that day when he came to see me, to talking about how volunteerism is a big part of what keeps Oregon so special. In that spirit, this bill honors the conservation legacy of two Oregonians who spent their lives working to keep Oregon special, Frank and Jean Moore. Frank Moore just embodies the Oregon way. He served in World War II. He returned to Oregon and settled with Jean in the North Umpqua, guiding generations of anglers on the river. Frank and Jean dedicated their lives to preservation and conservation of the Umpqua River. For somebody who knows a thing or two about casting a fly rod, Frank Moore understood just how important protecting the river is. I and my colleagues have felt it's long past time to honor Frank and Jean's legacy along the river and in their community. That's what this bill does. I went and visited them not long after we made a judgment that we wanted to protect these Oregon icons and their conservation legacy. And now Frank and Jean Moore will be recognized in this bill for protecting nearly 100,000 acres of Forest Service land near the North Umpqua River through the inclusion of the Frank and Jean Moore Salmon Sanctuary. As anybody who works on public lands legislation knows, sometimes it's hard to find a balance in order to get public lands legislation passed. Nobody gets everything they want. Nobody gets everything they believe they ought to have. The question is, can you bring people together? And I'm going to close by way of saying that I've highlighted a number of provisions that I'm glad we got in here. It was 10 years earlier when then President Obama signed 7 pieces of public lands legislation that I was the lead author of. So these opportunities don't come along all the time. And there are additional protections that I wish were in this bill we will vote on in a few hours. I particularly wanted further protections for the Rogue and the Molalla rivers. And I want to say to the people that I'm so honored to represent at home that as soon as we get this done, we're going to go back and start building support to get those protections through Congress in the future. And I'm optimistic that if we can have the same kind of cooperation I've been talking about this morning, we can get them across the finish line. This public lands bill may not be perfect, Mr. President, but it is a major accomplishment. And if you had told me in a polarized political climate like the one we have today that we could get a permanent authorization for the Land and Water Conservation Fund, I would have said, no way, can't happen. But now we've got real protection for, as it's called, LWCF. And I'm just going to close by mentioning, finally, my friend, our late Republican governor, Tom McCall. He embodies, and you see it in this book, Fire at Eden's Gate, The Oregon Story. Tom McCall, a Republican, embodies Oregon's long and proud history of conservation. And I want to close by saying the reason I focused on Tom McCall this morning is that he's part of a historical legacy. And sometimes over the last few years, I've gotten the sense that that historical set of principles, that protecting public lands was not a partisan issue. Sometimes I felt it was just slipping away. Today, Mr. President, it seems to me we're pushing back. We're headed in the right direction, and protecting the special places my home state is known for is something that gives me great pride. It's also something you bring some humility to, because Tom McCall was in a league of his own with respect to protecting our treasures. And I'm very glad today with the Oregon provisions in this bill, we can build on Tom McCall's legacy, and I am proud to have been able to play a role in making sure those provisions that help Oregon and our country have been included in this bill. With that, Mr. President, I yield the floor. I'd note the absence of a quorum. I withdraw my request for a quorum.